Hi, I'm poet and writer Kay Spivey, and I am finally doing my favorite books I read in 2020 list. These aren't going to be in a particular order, but I've kind of grouped them by like type of book. And these are just the ones that I was still thinking about for ages after I finished reading them. They were the book of my heart. They were so good. Everything about them was a 5-star read to me that I was obsessed with. There are some really good books I read last year that aren't on this list, and there are some books that I read that I really enjoyed. The first one that comes to mind is Brightly Burning, which I loved that book. It was so cool, and I contemplated putting it on this list, and then I thought I wasn't quite obsessed with it, and I wanted to put like just my top reads on this list and kind of narrow it down. These aren't books that came out last year. These are books I personally read last year. First on the list was Muse of Nightmares. It took me so long to read the second book in the Stranger Things duology. And I had another friend who I had read Stranger Things first and recommended it to her, and then she read this one right away and was like, you have to read this, we have to talk about it. And it took me so long because I didn't want the duology to end. Stranger Things leaves on this cliffhanger that is just like, how could this possibly go over well? Well, the reason Muse of Nightmares is on this list is because I could not have predicted the way things went. Like at any point in here, I was like, well, okay, in a novel you would expect it to go this way, or maybe it's a little edgy so it'll go this way. No, she kept on surprising me. It was just, her writing style is already lovely, but the surprising aspect is why I'm gonna go and read everything she's written at some point here, because if anything is as good as this series, I know I'm going to really like it. So often, you know, you like watch a movie and you're like, I understand plot structure, I understand basic story structure, so I can predict what things are gonna happen. And sometimes it annoys my husband when I'm just like, this thing's gonna happen now, and then it does happen. But you know, things can be really obvious. I'm not talking like Padme is Queen Amidala obvious, because I did not get that when I was a little tiny and watched the movie. Things where you just understand how things are gonna go. To read something where that's not what happens and it still fits so comfortably into the characterization and the world building and everything else is just, it's so nice to read something that surprises you like that. So that's why this is on my list, because I was so pleased with where this went and just couldn't have expected it. Next up might be my favorite fantasy novel now, and that is Uprooted. I adored this. I think I've mentioned it several times. If you enjoyed Howl's Moving Castle, probably the book, not as much the movie, you would definitely like Uprooted. It has a lot of that kind of wild energy, but still like this like impossible wizard. Not impossible as in he couldn't exist, but like he's driving you crazy, but there's still a romance. It was cute. I liked the magic system. I liked that this book ended up being kind of a commentary on school standards. Like in the way that her magic is very strong, but nobody believed that because her magic works in a totally different way. She understands magic in a different way than all these wizards have been taught to understand magic. And so they're like, well, you can't be doing it. You're not doing it right. It's incorrect. But she is doing magic, and she's doing strong magic, and it ends up being a huge benefit to her. It's kind of like the way we teach children. Like some children learn in a different way, and they're just as smart and just as capable. But maybe this is me reading into it and being like an English major over here. But that was so cool, is seeing someone learn and adapt and thrive a completely different way from everybody else, and that ends up being a benefit for her rather than a detriment, even though everyone is like, no, you're doing it wrong, you're not a real wizard. But it also, like, it ended up having these really interesting dark elements. The tension was always so high, the danger was so high, but also like the love and the friendship was also so deep and wonderful. It just, to me, this was a wonderful story. I really enjoyed it. Next up, and I feel like if you didn't expect this on this list, you crazy, because I did all kinds of videos about it. Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. I should have read this a long time ago when people were like, oh, you're going to like it so much. And I was like, yeah, probably. Oh, it's fine. I went into this expecting like dreary fan fiction, it was so much better. I didn't realize there was going to be so much world building, such a like deconstruction of that type of genre. I didn't realize the romance was going to like make me want to vomit in the best possible way, where like I couldn't get it out of my system. I was lying awake at night scrolling Pinterest for fan art of these two. Like, I was so into it. And then when I read the sequel, I've already done a video, so I won't go too far into it, but I will say this is a really good standalone novel. It doesn't have a sequel. Ignore it. Depending upon how the next one that's supposed to come out in 2021 is, it might be that this is just totally a standalone novel. If that one's good, I might recommend... I hated Wayward Son. I hated it, and I read that also, and that would be on my like least favorites books of the year, because it just didn't do anything. But that doesn't change the fact that this book, on its own, separate from anything else she's written, was kind of perfect. I loved it. I did listen to the audiobook though, and so I know that the chapters are like really fast and constantly changing perspective, and the narrator for the audiobook navigates that so beautifully. You never get lost. I don't know if reading it on the page you get the same experience, because I listened to the audiobook, but oh, it was so good. I listened to the audiobook twice is how good this was. Next up is another one that we talked quite a bit about, and I thought this was gonna be just like a, okay, I've read it, totally done. This one had me thinking. I was watching movies. I'm still, all of these are books that I would recommend to friends, that I have recommended to friends, and this one's one I'm still recommending. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This was really good. If you're like, I don't like older style books, like this book has been out for so long, I'm not into horror, I'm not into thriller, I'd still say go for this. Her writing style is so accessible. It feels so modern in like an effortless way. It was just so interesting. The ending, it's a lot. This book is a lot, and it's so good. There's a reason that this book is like having a resurrection. Now, don't go in thinking it's going to be like the show. Don't go in thinking it's going to be like any of the movies. None of them are quite this. She did do it the best. Like, there are great adaptations of it, but this is worth the read. And it's tiny. It's so thin. Look at this compared to Carry On. Like, you can spend some time and read this and like get what the hype is about. It's so interesting that a book that is this old feels this recent. I'm totally floored by this. I'll probably read something else by Shirley Jackson to see if this is just like her magnum opus or if some of her other ones are just as good. Next up, we're going to transition a little bit, and I wanted to talk about a graphic novel that I really, really loved reading this year, and that is Nimona, which I still have lent out to a friend, so I don't have it here to show you. But Nimona, I didn't read it when Ginger Hayes was all over the internet and when this was coming out, when she was writing it, but I finally found the graphic novel and it's amazing. This is another one where just like it takes a genre and undermines it and just takes it in a different direction, and it's fun and funny, but also really, really deep. There's a reason that she's now running shows like She-Ra. Like, she's a great storyteller, and she's great at taking these characters and showing them in a way that's not necessarily the way you've always seen them. Like, she talks about love in an interesting way, and friendship in an interesting way, and corporations in an interesting way, and science in an interesting way. Like, there's so many levels to this graphic novel with this like deceptively simple art style that shows so much action. It's such a fantastic graphic novel. If you're looking for something kind of on a fantasy lean, but that also will challenge you without trying to confuse you, Nimona is incredible. It is completely lives up to all the hype. It is so worth it. Next is the book of my heart. This could have been my favorite read this year. I've read so many good books this year. I'm just gushing about all these books. This book sort of sent my mind in a new direction, I think, and that is The Poet X. This had sort of been vaguely on my radar for a while. I don't know if I was intimidated by a novel in verse. I don't know if I just hadn't read any good novels in verse. I don't know that I for sure knew this was a novel in verse or like what that was going in. And once I got started on this, I was so captivated. I couldn't stop. Her poetry is so good. And the story she's telling, the girl having a crisis of faith, talking about her body and how her body has been such a detriment. People talk about it like she's doing something wrong, but this is just the body she's grown into, and she's being punished for just being who she is on the simplest level, on a body level. And how that's not okay with the church, and how it's not okay with her mom, and how it's not okay with boys at school, and her constantly having to defend herself and stand up for herself and be the person she wants to be. And that poetry is so integral to that identity of her, and to not only understanding herself but expressing herself in a way that feels authentic to her, and to help bridge that gap with her mother. I mean, there's so much going on in this book, and it's so gorgeously written. I would say if you're interested in getting into poetry but you're more of a story person, or if you've read some novels in verse and you're like, that's not really my thing, this is the one to give a try, because I do think this stands out as a bit of a pinnacle. I mean, like, look at all the awards it's already won. Like, other people have probably said this and said this better, but this is a phenomenal collection. And I absolutely, again, recommended this to all of my friends. I would keep recommending this just because I was so, I mean, I read this in one sitting, in one day. I couldn't stop. I was so into it. It was just fantastic. I'm going to, but I haven't yet read anything else by Elizabeth Acevedo. But obviously, if any of it even remotely stands up to this, it's going to be fantastic. And honestly, if this were the only thing she had ever written in her life, that would be such a huge success story of a writer. This is, I can't gush enough. I can't gush enough about how good this is. Next up is poetry. One of the first poetry books that I actually read last year is If They Come For Us by Fatima Asghar. The cover is what drew me to it, because stunning. This cover is so beautiful. I think I've talked about this and said the exact same thing. But this is one of the most powerful political poetry collections I've ever read. It's political in the way it talks about Trump. I actually read this at like the exact right time. I think I read this right after he was impeached the first time. And she wrote this, I think, if I'm not wrong, either when he was running for president or like the first year after he became president, or maybe it was even before that. But she talks about the American politics, and she talks about family, and she talks about her heritage, and it all combines in this way that is so familiar, even though it's so opposite my own experiences. Like, she just draws you in and is like, here are the ways in which my life is like your life, and you're like, wait a minute, but they're not the same. No, I don't know how to explain that aspect, but it felt like we were sisters together in this universe, even though my identity and my perspective, everything is so opposite hers. She invites you in, but she does not pull her punches. And she has a lot of poems that are like here, or a lot of these like interesting form poems. And I have talked many times, I typically don't like a form poem. I typically feel like they can be gimmicky, and I feel like there are many people who use them in lieu of actually writing a poem, that the form is trying to say things because the actual poem isn't saying enough on its own. I didn't think that was the case. All of the interesting ones, and there aren't too many also. I think that's also, there's a nice balance between just like poetry and doing some of these forms, that they're adding emphasis. They're adding a little bit more context to what she's saying. Highly recommend this collection for anyone. If you enjoy more modern poetry, if you enjoy poetry with a little bit heavier topics, definitely go for this. If you just want to like expand your horizons and learn. I think she's a phenomenal poet. I'm going to have to see if she has any other collections out because I like this so much. I definitely need to read more from her. And then last, but certainly not least, I did sort of discover maybe the best poet in the world. I'm not sure. I haven't read every poet in the entire world. Patricia Smith, and I have had this book, but I had not read it, which was my own fault because I could have discovered her a lot earlier. But Patricia Smith wrote the most gorgeous collection. The poetry itself in here is everything that poetry can be. Like, it's so musical, it's so effortless, it's so vibrant. It was so good that, and I think I'll link the video that I talked about this one because it also devastated me. There were some poems in here that I actually recommend skipping over because they were so haunting and so horrific, but that she got way the heck under my skin with them. Just dug on in there and settled in like some kind of mean poetry parasite. Like, it's still, I'm tearing up a little bit still thinking about those poems because they were so deeply under my skin. Like, this collection hits on so many types of love and anti-love. You should just stop everything and go just read any poem that she's written because just the way she uses language is breathtaking. I would be hard pressed to find someone who writes as well as she wrote. I've only read this collection of hers, Tea House of the Almighty, but I'm sure, given that every poem in here was so vibrantly written, I'm sure all of her poetry is this strong, and I'm so glad I finally read it because it was well worth my time. Even the poems that were really harsh. And again, this book, I have to say, has a trigger warning. Some of her poems are based on real events that happened, like that she read in the news, most likely. There's a very journalistic aspect to this, but she comes at some horrific child abuse stories from the child's perspective, and it's not easy to read, but it's really well written, and that's why it's so hard to read. And that's why she's definitely on my list, because I don't know if anything is gonna haunt me the way the one that you should definitely skip is always going to haunt me. So highly recommend Patricia Smith. Those were the best books that I read in 2020, which is a year that I'm glad is over. But wow, it was a good reading year for me. I mean, these are some like deep favorites. These are some like top of my list now favorites, my like go-to recommendation favorites. What a good year to choose to read some really good books, right? Like, I have all kinds of honorable mentions that I kicked off this list because I was just like, no, these have to be my favorite books. Let me know if you've read any of these books in the comments down below, if you also enjoyed them, because they were really good. And if you hated them, we can fight about it. I will fight you on any one of these, because these were, I mean, a few of them I could see where your perspective might come from, but I'll fight you anyway, because these were fantastic reads. I was so happy, and I'm really hoping that 2021 I can fall in love with half as many books and really get to read some really genuinely phenomenal content that's gonna stick with me and make me happy, because that's what reading should be all about. Reading should be about making you happy, making you feel things, and giving you a new perspective on the world. Yep, so that's all for me today. I will talk to you again soon, and good luck to you. Bye.